Hello everyone, Brandon here. Well, my piece in the Star Tribune was published last Sunday, back on the 5th, and it was a full pager in the Star Tribune asking the big question, is Minnesota in trouble? And a big question like that, I suppose, could be answered simply yes or no, but I went the other way and took 2,300 words to examine it. And I offered what I think is a pretty novel angle on the culprit for why it's not doing as well as it has been doing. I want to talk a little bit about the story, and then, though, since it's been about 9-10 days since it was published in the paper, I want to talk about the response to the story, because the responses have been all over the place, right? In some ways, some people are mad about it, and some people are cheering for it, and in other ways, I'm getting some really well thought out emails from people that are really encouraging me that I at least hit upon something here that some really considerate people who care about our state appreciate. So I really appreciate those emails. So the question of Minnesota, is it in trouble? Now, one could look at it real data heavy. I do offer some data in here, but I offer more of a general, like, in addition to some data, like the vibe, right? So the fact that we have two sides of the state like fighting over the state flag, and it's not so much in the news anymore, but if you drive around Minnesota, you'll see plenty of people still flying the old one, and it's like, well, what's up with that? Last May, when the session ended, there was a lot of yelling and fighting and anger, and so there's just a vibe going on in the state. Obviously, there was George Floyd and the riots. So yeah, there have been some big profile stuff, some more subtle stuff, and I think in general there's agreement that, you know, we've had better days, and certainly if you compare it to like the 90s and before, Minnesota was just always at the top five in all these things, and it still is in a lot of ways, and that's what my subheading gets at, and the subheading also talks then about. It gets at what I think is a novel approach to what is the cause for this dissent, I guess, for lack of a better term. So our state is ranked high, it reads, and indeed I open up the piece by saying it's number 4 in U.S. News and World Report's best states list that came out this last May. Our state is ranked high, but we achieved success in an era better suited for our strengths. Times have changed, and now our weaknesses are starting to show. So that's what this piece does. It looks at Minnesota, what made it a top 5 state. And so I talk about its strengths, you know, and those of us here know this. Those of us aren't in Minnesota might be interested to know that we've got a lot of Fortune 500 companies. We have obviously like the Mayo Clinic and famous institutions like that, research institutions. We've historically had low crime, really good education, really good health. And again, a lot of these things still hold today. Some don't, though. And we built this culture like that, right? But this was built in a different time. And now we're in this new time. And I explain this in this way. Times now are more, they're less static and reliable and steady, and they're more chaotic. They're more dynamic, is maybe a better word. And what are Minnesotans known for? Are they known as being dynamic and like confrontational and aggressive? No, we're kind of the opposite. And those are the weaknesses I refer to in that subheading. I say our weaknesses are starting to show. These were weaknesses that weren't very prominent. They were talked about, they were joked about, stereotyped as it's hard to make friends here. People move here, and it's like, I say that in the story. I say I lost count of how many grad students and young professionals I got to know in my 20s saying, "Man, yeah, you know, it's a lovely state. I've got a nice place to live. I've got a good job, but." Man, I'm having a tough time just meeting people and finding, you know, kind of my circle of friends. Minnesotans are like that, like stereotypically, again, the kind of the reserved, distant. We're welcoming and we're agreeable, and we have a pretty high level of extroversion according to the Big 5 personality traits. that spell out ocean, and that's important for this story because I mentioned are the one in which we're at the bottom at. The 5 traits are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And for extroversion and agreeableness, we score pretty high. And so that's why, we'll, like I said, we're pretty welcoming and even talkative. But the idea of being really close and connected, that's a whole different story. And that denotes our lack of openness, the first of the 5. And in fact, nationally, I don't know if we're at the bottom, but we're one of the very bottom. We're like 49th or something like that. And you'll see that a lot of upper Midwest states suffer in that regard. And this was all brought together as I lay out in this piece in a study that kind of classified the regions of the U.S. and it classified the upper Midwest as friendly and conventional. So we'll say hi, we're warm, but we're not open. We're not very flexible. There's a rigidity there, and that's not good for these days, I argue, because these are days where there's more conflict, there's more diversity, there's more ideas being floated around, some of them radical. And how does a state do, how does a society do when they're known for being not very open and they're dealing with a time where borders don't mean as much, there's more migration, there's more fluidity. So I think it's a clash. I think it's a clear clash. And I credit that ultimately for why our state has dropped in crime, in education, and I lay those sorts of statistics out. So what should we do about that? Well, that's hard to answer. You can't just change culture on a dime, but I do suggest opening up, even though we're not very high on openness. Try to open up to some other ideas, to some other, like why are other regions doing better? Why do states in the South, why are they having a migration that way, at least certain states? Tennessee, Florida, Texas, right? These are states that stereotypically are going to deal with conflict a little more head on. Minnesota's passive aggressive, Minnesota's conflict avoidant. Again, not a great idea in these times where there's just more conflict in the world. They're better at, if not integration with diverse groups, coexisting. And I think Minnesota struggles with that. It's that same kind of closed off approach. So we'll welcome people in, and this is what sets Minnesota apart even from other states in the upper Midwest, is that we're proudly progressive in general. Right? That's Minnesotans are often proud of that fact. Yeah, we're more progressive and liberal on things that our neighbors are stodgy about. Okay, but then you welcome all these people in and offer them help, and that's wonderful. But if you don't really connect, then you still get this segregated distance. And I think that that's a big part of what keeps the racial achievement gap here very high in a number of ways, whether it's education, income, home ownership, etc. Again, there's that dynamic of being welcoming but not connected. And I think you need that connection. And sometimes you need it to help people, and sometimes you need that connection to tell people no and to deal with conflict head on. And we're not good at that either. So we have, I think that encourages and enables more conflict to happen. There's actually a Somali man who wrote an article this summer that basically implores Minnesotan officials to handle crime head on. He advises them, be tougher on crime. The other thing I mentioned is technology. And there was a Minnesotan who used his stereotypical Minnesotan good education, innovative, and thought, why don't I use AI to help with a conference to get people all together and discuss these social issues. So kind of a nightmare situation for Minnesotans to want to come together and talk about these intense topics, but he did it in a way that involved AI, which might turn people off, but the way he did it I thought was pretty ingenious. Let's use AI to match people based on their interests, which is something that people provided before the conference, and then And then they'll find people without having to go out and search for them amongst a room of a bunch of people. They'll have something there to kind of prime the pump, to break the ice, the Minnesota nice walls that we have up, and then get them talking. And by some measures, or even many measures, this event was very successful. It was societal in nature, talking about social issues, but it was also entrepreneurial. And this gentleman, Brandon Klein, who I quote in the story, said that he had I want to get this right. I think he had 3 or 4 people get jobs. He had a startup lined up for funding based on the activity of that day, and then the follow-up, which was also facilitated by AI. And then, perhaps most impressive, he had at least 2 companies who had an international presence begin discussion of moving operations in Minnesota because they were so impressed by that. So I really love that example because it's sort of using the trends today that make life in some ways hard, technology and the internet and things being more remote, us having a harder time competing with our neighboring states with lower taxes because businesses are more fluid and can migrate easier themselves. So that makes it difficult for Minnesota to compete. But in this case, that fluidity and the use of AI and this allowed for the conversation to flourish and these outside companies to discover what Minnesota has to offer. The event went well using technology, and by opening up to outside voices, I think Minnesota can find its way back to where I think it needs to be, and that's the center. We've also in this day and age drifted, which I think many states have one way or the other. So Minnesota is no different in being susceptible to the ideological drift. And here in the piece, I talk about us drifting to the left because, well, that's just how Minnesota tends to lean. So I think in these days, the lean is just we're more susceptible to lean further one way or the other. And within Minnesota, you'll see polarization politically. So if you go to rural parts, red parts of the state, you'll find very conservative people now. But as the state as a whole tends to lean a little left, it's leaned really far left in some ways. And I say in the story that that's a bad thing. And this is where I got a lot of the shallow feedback, the more the knee-jerk responses, if now we move into the feedback portion of this video. So that feedback was real retaliatory. Oh, calling me a Republican, mentioning Trump, even though my piece doesn't, things like that. The more thoughtful feedback was came in the form of some emails where I'll actually read a couple of quotes from them. I have them on my monitor here. And I wrote about this on some social media on a social media post, so I'll read it word for word. Feedback came in from those pretty passionate about this matter of our state's well-being. This included an old DFLer, DFL being the Democratic Farm Labor Party, the Democrats in our state. He litigated for the Minneapolis Housing Authority in the city during the Civil Rights Movement. So this is a guy that, he's probably up there in age, a senior, and was, basically fighting for civil rights causes back in the 70s, I believe, he said. He said, we were Humphrey Democrats, and that's Hubert H. Humphrey, like Walter Mondale and a well-known DFLer, which is what Minnesota is, again, known for. But this retired attorney said, we were Humphrey Democrats. And he did so to describe his politics, but also contrasting their politics with what he sees today. And so his was a longer, broader perspective on, kind of what's happened to the state and his concern about that, and how maybe the party that he knew and he was proud to be a part of isn't quite what it was before. And then I had a retired journalism professor who also founded and wrote for several publications, shared how she grew up in North Minneapolis in the 60s. I've thought about these issues for a long time, she said. In addition to the crime rate going from third safest to 18th today, and that's been from the 70s till today, so that's over 50 years time. That's a slow, but education in just the last 10 years has gone from 6th in the nation, down to 19th. So now we're more middle of the pack, and that's not where Minnesota has been known to be. We're supposed to be a top 5 state. And when I grew up in school in the 80s and 90s, we were, and the teachers would tell me that in high school. So they see this. These 2 emails and others see this same gradual, and and kind of avoiding the knee-jerk pushback against my assertions, which isn't, pushback isn't a bad thing. Obviously, I could be challenged on a lot of this. Some of these, like, are we open or aren't we open? These sorts of more mushy ideas, I think there's room for definite pushback there, or suddenly my theory gets a little spongy. But if you just look at the general degradation over 50 years, and alarmingly so over the last decade, I think this is an important piece because it brings to people's awareness, or rings the alarm a little bit about, hey, we need to turn this around, and it's not going to be easy to do that. It's a cultural thing. It offers kind of a novel theory as to why, but then that novel theory also isn't one that's easily remedied. Yeah, I don't know. We'll see. One story doesn't do usually a whole lot to move the needle on things, but I'm grateful for the Star Tribune for giving me the voice, and for you for listening. Any thoughts on the matter of Minnesota, how it's doing? It's not doing as well. Why is that? What do you think? And then what do you think we should do about it? I'm definitely eager to hear your thoughts on that. Whatever we can do, I think, to get back to a calmer, reasonable place, because anything that continues to split the state, we can talk about particular policy, but the general divisiveness will continue to break apart greater Minnesota from the Twin Cities. Is just that's poison. A house divided against itself cannot stand, right? This is classic understanding of how a society operates and stays together. We need to unite. We need to start to work together, the left and the right, and then perhaps proceed with what policies to support in order to turn the state around. But right now, it's all about, I think, coming to the table. All right. Thanks for your time, and I'll see you later.